Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Sheher-o-logy. And today, I am Ishleen Kaur, and I work with the Water and Environment vertical here at the National Institute of Urban Affairs. And I'm here with my colleague Uday Bhonde, Dr. Uday Bhonde, and he happens to lead the work on groundwater management, and that is exactly what we are going to discuss today. How groundwater can actually play a very, very important role in ensuring water security in our cities. And on that note, Uday, we are talking about this on a day when it's already raining in Delhi, so there's a lot of water out there that is going into the drains and running off, and at the same time, we are constantly talking about day zero in a lot of our cities. So there's such a mismatch between all of this surplus water that we are not able to tap into, and that's where exactly today's conversation is about. That how do we really tap into all of the surplus water while also dealing with our water scarcity issues?
Now, indeed, there is a paradox. Like at one end we have water scarcity, but at the other end we have excess rainfall. The cities facing the urban flooding kind of things, and then there's a lot which goes as a mess in the urban areas. So Ishleen, just to begin with, I would like to mention that a few years ago, around year 2022, the UN World Water Day had a very, very impactful theme, and that was on a groundwater making invisible visible. And that was so much on time, where we are facing this kind of situation. So before we delve into the conversation about the groundwater and how we can mainstream in the urban development agenda, I would like to highlight few very interesting numbers. And these numbers are really fascinating numbers. Now we all know that on our earth, almost 97% is of water which is in the ocean, right? And only 3% water is the fresh water that we can utilize actually. And very interestingly, only minuscule, that is, this fraction of water is on surface water. Otherwise, everything is locked either in the icebergs or it is in the groundwater. So 30% water is in the groundwater, and that is the resource which we can very well leverage to address all the issues and everything. Now these are the numbers which are on a global scale. But if you look at the groundwater consumption across world, India is the largest user of groundwater, and it extracts even double than US and China combined together. So that is the enormous amount of groundwater that we are extracting. Of course, we are an agrarian country, so we certainly extract more groundwater. But I think a lot of dedicated missions of two prime ministries that I will talk, Ministry of Jal Shakti and Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. These two ministries in a past decade has dedicatedly designed the missions which are focused towards this groundwater. Right now, if you look at the Ministry of Jal Shakti, they have a Jal Shakti Abhiyan, a dedicated mission to conserve the groundwater. Then they also have a programs like NAQUIN, the National Urban Aquifer Management Program. So these are the dedicated efforts of the Ministry of Jal Shakti. But here, since we're talking about the cities, and since we are very well connected to Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, I think the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs efforts on this particular groundwater are also very commendable. So there is a dedicated mission called Amrut 2 mission. So in Amrut 2 mission, we have cities preparing the urban aquifer management plans. So this is the first, perhaps in my memory, a dedicated effort where the cities are looking at the groundwater, and they are collating the data as a effort to systematically start managing the groundwater in the urban areas. So that's the national level scenario, and then there are several other things that are very interesting that we'll discuss. But here, Ishleen, I would like to bring your perspective, because you are architect and you have worked on the Delhi Master Plan, which was prepared by our Institute, National Institute of Urban Affairs. And now, since we are talking about the groundwater and its mainstreaming, of course, it has to be integrated in the urban planning processes. So, in your opinion, do you think that the groundwater has a correct placement in the planning process, or does it cover this very critical resource, or I would say a source of water supply for the cities to conserve or protect? So, what is your opinion on that?
Thank you, Uday, for sharing all of that information. It's very interesting to know that the focus is now coming towards city to manage their groundwater better. And you rightly asked that while all of this is happening, how is really city mainstreaming groundwater into its master plan. And interestingly, when we talk about Delhi, Delhi actually is looking at very, very far off resources to get its water. While we already have this local resource, we already have our groundwater reserves, which we extract, but we probably are not thinking that scientifically about replenishing them. So exactly what master plan also started looking into, that how can we really mainstream groundwater into the planning, into the 20-year roadmap of development now. So one of the most interesting things that this time, and this was probably the first time that Delhi master plan looked at it, was looking at the recharge and discharge zones for groundwater, and accordingly, look at the areas that need to be protected and look at the areas that need to be tapped to recharge all of this groundwater. The consumption of groundwater in Delhi, it's unfortunately we don't monitor all of this consumption that is happening. A lot of it happens also informally, but what we can do is we can fill in that water back, and that's exactly what the master plan looked at when it started looking at concepts like water sensitive urban design, something that is talked about globally. It's being incorporated in cities in a very big manner, is now actually also finding its way into India, into Delhi. And one of the good examples is that we have now sort of put in or mandated the city to look into, whenever they are creating public infrastructure, parks, or all the open green spaces, they look at the recharge component,
Yes.
which is very great. And some of this is actually also very visible in cities like Chennai, that has gone ahead and sort of
Yes.
looking at the larger sponge area or sponge gardens that they are creating.
Right.
So those are the very innovative interventions that cities are already looking into. And while Delhi master plan has only taken the first step towards managing the groundwater better, but we really need more capacity, more more knowledge in this
Absolutely.
department. And exactly where I know that you have been working on this particular subject for 2-3 years now, and you have seen how much the lack of knowledge is there, how much capacities we really need to build.
Yeah.
So I would really love to know that what all is happening in that department.
Yes, so that's great. But just to pick that particular planning aspect, what you narrated, there's something called recharge and discharge zones within the cities, right? So, do our master plan look at this recharge and discharge zones, or do they have any, provisions to conserve? Is there any such example you have?
So we do have examples coming up now, like mostly the groundwater management part, the data part was looked at the block level. That was the granularity of data that we had. But now cities are moving towards, also doing a comprehensive assessment. Unfortunately, none of the master plans, or neither Delhi master plan, had a very scientific assessment.
Yes.
What we usually ended up seeing was ad hoc rainwater harvesting interventions that were happening. But I think the work that I have understood from your side, that I have seen from Sam's side, there's a lot happening on the comprehensive assessment.
Absolutely.
And it would be really interesting to know more on that.
Sure, I'll share that. So, in our previous episode of Sheher-o-logy, our colleagues spoke about the, what the water space that we are covering, and in that I think it was covered like shallow aquifer management, what we are doing, and I would really request the viewers to look at that particular episode, because it covered a large gamut and a large spectrum of work that is being done. But interestingly, when we are talking about the Amrut mission, so in the same year when this UN's theme was declared, incidentally in the same year, our institution, National Institute of Urban Affairs, was supported by Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs to do one pilot project, and that pilot project was in 10 cities to just explore what way the cities can be motivated to look at the groundwater. And this 10 cities give a very good examples. I mean, they're located in different geoclimatic terrains, so they have a different rainfall patterns, different water consumption patterns, different challenges. So a pilot test was done, and then based on the success of that pilot project, now ministry is scaling up in the 75 cities, and this 75 cities are again located in a different geographies, different climatic zones, to to explore how the groundwater can be brought into the highlight, or maybe it can be mainstream. So primarily with two objectives we started this. First was, since you mentioned that there's a little attentions by cities towards this precious resource, or I would say a natural asset. The first idea was to build the capacity of the urban local body officials, how they actually can understand the resource, they can understand, map, also protect, and at least some sensitization is there. So that was one. And second was to actually demonstrate variety of recharge interventions, because what happens usually in our in our understanding, when we say groundwater, usually the rooftop rainwater harvesting is the thing that comes to our mind, and most of the cities practice that. Of course, many cities have their provisions also, the bylaws and other kind of things. They say that if you have this much square feet of area, then you need to have a rainwater harvesting mechanism. But in this project, the work was to demonstrate variety of recharge interventions. And I would like to I'm glad to highlight that the demonstration was like, there was a demonstration of a catchment level treatment that can augment the groundwater supply. Here we are also not saying that cities should completely rely on the groundwater, but they should also complement this with the groundwater supply, and that's where the concept of the conjunctive water management is there, right? So then there was also attention towards the heritage structures. Like in our cities, we have a beautiful heritage wells, open wells, dug wells, and these resources unfortunately are slightly gone at the backside, because there is a good water supply. I mean, that is ensured by the urban local bodies, but then the idea was also to showcase that, look, these resources are also important and we should conserve them. So heritage wells were conserved, and there were very good examples of how the urban flooding can be mitigated. So in some cities, the demonstrations were dedicated to the urban flood mitigation. So and there are very, very positive results of that. So now we are scaling up the same thing in 75 cities, but with a larger mandate of scaling up. Plus also some research aspects are integrated in terms of how the other stakeholders, particularly the academic institutions or the other think tanks, can also come, and then they share their research that can benefit the urban local bodies. So that is the overall idea about the effort that we are doing. But here one thing which I see is the participatory aspect, the communities and their engagement, because it's usually said that the groundwater is a common resource and it's a shared resource, and certainly the communities has to be in the front. So Ishleen, would you like to share that, how the communities can play, and some good examples if there are, and it will be good to share the audience.
What we realized while working in SAM was how important people become in
Yes.
securing our water resources, and the examples that we saw in cities like Dhanbad, in Bangalore, where people were not just looking at using the water, they were pretty much also interested in how do you protect and how do you then restore the wells. So when we talk about wells, although they are a big part of our Indian heritage, we probably don't associate them much with urban. But when we went to these cities, we pretty much realized how much they are, very, very inherently a part of the urban fabric, and more importantly of people's life. So I remember when we were in Dhanbad and we were in peri-urban Dhanbad, how women were, there at the well.
Yes.
Like it was pretty much a place where they are spending so much time because the water is needed for all of those household chores. So it automatically became not just a place where they are finding the source for their household, source of water for their household, but also a social space for them. So, it was then when the realization came to us that these people really have to become pretty much a part of this movement. And similarly, Bangalore, which is, we really know Bangalore as the Silicon City, but when we look at different areas, and especially again peri-urban areas, we realize how much they are dependent on groundwater. And one of the interventions that was that was implemented under the Shallow Aquifer Management Project actually ended up supplying water for 500 families in Bangalore.
Yes, yes.
So when people see the value that these wells are bringing, they actually want to take up the protection and the custody part too. And that was pretty much what we saw and what we witnessed in our interventions in different cities. And great you brought about the example of the heritage part too, like
Yes.
the step wells. The step wells in Hyderabad, they have been restored, and they are not just now a place where people just go to look at the heritage of the city, but they are also now, fulfilling the function of water recharge. So they have been restored in a way where they are acting as that living heritage, that function that they used to play. So that has been a very, very interesting take on how groundwater management is beyond the water source. It's actually pretty much tied to the life of people, and that's why people have to be at the forefront when we are protecting this. But at the same time, Uday, when we talk about protection, we mostly end up looking at the physical part of it.
Yes.
But we recently saw the Indore example, and we do realize that how our groundwater resources are also very exposed to the risk of contamination. So how do you think we can in future prevent such episodes, prevent such contamination happening in our groundwater reserves?
Yeah, amazing, Ishleen. I think, as you said, communities are really, the true beneficiaries, right? And I remember in some communities when we look at their, a specific strata, socioeconomic strata, for them when the water is insured, it is, ensuring their opportunity cost losses kind of thing. Like the women and the beneficiaries, they were narrating that actually their girls are able to go to schools, and also in the evening time, I mean, when they used to go to fetch the water a little far, that security aspect was also there in their mind, that was ensured when some such dilapidated wells were protected. So you can understand, and you rightly said that the communities are at the forefront. And when you spoke about the protection of this important asset, yes, they're very vulnerable in cities, particularly to the pollution and the multiple aspects, not only one. Like if I just narrate, like if you have an inadequate sewage infrastructure in the cities, like if there are leaking sewers or if there are septic tanks which are not appropriately designed, particularly the shallow aquifers are very vulnerable to the pollution, right? And also interestingly, we in the cities we have high-rise building, right? When you construct the high-rise building, of course you need a good basement. Now in that basement construction, we extract and pump a lot of water, groundwater, precious shallow aquifer, which is a lifeline for many such communities, is permanently destroyed. I would say it's destroyed, right? Now when you said, I was remembering that recent case of Indore where there was some unfortunate incident occurred. So in Delhi also, I remember a few years back there was a news I would say a news that people, when they fetch the water from the hand pumps or a borewell, it was a red color, right? So the color has changed, the physical form of that water has changed, and that's because there was a huge solid waste dump which was leaching some kind of the pollutants, and that they entered. Now once the aquifer, we say that aquifer from where we extract the groundwater is contaminated, it's perhaps irreversible if it is going beyond some point, and that's how the vulnerability lies. So certainly there's a strong aspect of a groundwater protection that we need to ensure when we also try to work around this through these missions on augmenting the water supply through the groundwater. Now this brings the aspect of a governance. This brings the aspect of strengthening the institutions. So would you like to highlight like how the institutions and governance can actually help in this particular groundwater protection or conservation?
The model groundwater bill, which is now being adopted by 21 states, which actually brings a very comprehensive understanding, a very robust regulatory framework also around managing and protecting our groundwater resources. And in the beginning of the of the episode, you rightly pointed out India is the largest extractor of groundwater, and that's why it's very, very important that we start from the top level of governance in regulating the groundwater management bit. So it's a very good step that has happened, wherein the model groundwater bill is now adopted by 21 states. The next layer of governance that comes, the regional or the district level, we now have this very innovative Catch the Rain program. We have Jal Shakti Kendras, and the last data that we have for it for 2025, there are actually 712 Jal Shakti Kendras under that campaign. So it's very interesting to see that already at the national as well as at the district level, all of this is happening. But most importantly, when it comes to city level, I think there cities are now starting to look at the groundwater governance models, and one of the best practices that we have come across is in Pune, where they have a dedicated groundwater cell which actually makes concerted efforts, and they study the groundwater aspects of the city, the different facets of quantity as well as quality, and then inform the ULB on how they can manage the groundwater sources better. And it's such a good time to actually look at that intervention, because Pune is also starting to look at its riverfront development. They're starting to work more on their water management strategies. So having a dedicated groundwater cell really can bring about those changes. And we have actually covered a gamut of topics here. We started with how groundwater is actually a very, very important aspect in the larger scheme of things in our cities' water management strategies, to communities being a major part of this movement, and also the governance aspect. But if you had to really give us like 6 or 7 pointed takeaways from this, what would you like to say about it?
True. I mean, it's like very interesting that the governance is also being strengthened parallelly, because that's the very critical aspect if we want to tap on this resource, which is lifeline for many, as we said. Now, in my opinion, or I would say in my limited understanding that we have through our exposure to this topic, I think the capacity building is one of the area which certainly should be strengthened with, by, of course, empowering the officials or the functionaries at the various levels, so that they, it's not that they don't value, but perhaps they think that's, that's not their mandate. It's like either central groundwater board or a state groundwater board. They are perhaps more to look at this aspect, but I think that scenario is certainly changing. So one is a training and capacity building. We certainly should have a good exposure visits, kind of a stuff, peer-to-peer learning kind of thing, so that there is a exchange of a knowledge. Of course, there should be a knowledge kind of a creation, so that there are tools available for the officials. So this is one area. The other aspect, I think, very importantly, we should have is a strong database, because in our experience when we are working in the 75 cities, the basic inventory kind of data and other things are also lacking. So a strong database, and maybe in our mission we are also trying to cover the dashboard kind of a thing, which will collate this data. It's like aspiration for us, and also something related to research, a very practical and a research that is benefited to city. But Ishleen, I'm sure you will also have your own understanding about this. So what is your take on this? How we can still do better with this kind of
Okay, I think you rightly pointed out about the training and capacity building part, the data, which is very, very crucial to actually do a comprehensive assessment. But it's also interesting to bring the private sector in this conversation. So far water has been, or groundwater largely has been looked at only by the public departments or public sector departments, but it's very important to now bring in certain stakeholders from the private sector to come in and pitch in terms of knowledge, in terms of how we can strengthen data. And one of the major things that private sector is actually contributing is in the innovation and technology.
Yes.
So we now have different technologies coming up to monitor the quality and the quantity of groundwater, and I think that is something that the ministry is also really looking at tapping into, this vast reserve of technology that we have in the groundwater space now. And besides that, like you said, like people, community governance, all of this is very important. But at the end of the day, it's also very important that as consumers, we are more responsible towards using our resources. I think all of us at some level are tapping into groundwater sources. Whenever we are at home or we are in office, we are all tapping into groundwater sources, and it's very important that we now start thinking about how much is the judicious consumption, and then accordingly change our behaviors.
True.
So I think Uday, I would actually give you
I think that's very important, and I think that's where lies the optimism, and that's where lies, because the government is also gearing up and pushing. Of course, it's like more in a more intensive way, I would say. And it's like usually we say that top down and bottom up approach. So both are actually trying to converge, and I'm sure very soon we'll have a very I would say a wiser approach towards looking at this groundwater as a very important resource, particularly in the urban area.
much needed. Thank you.
Great, thanks.